Genesis 1-2 through the rest of the chapter is very much describing the same ideas as the Egyptians would talk about their creation. That's a very consistent ancient Near Eastern way of perceiving it, of describing the physical universe. We do see some talking snakes in Egypt.
Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Dr. Soden. We're going to be talking about Egyptian context of Genesis 1 and 2. This is a very, very fascinating talk that does not get talked about enough. Okay, how are we doing today, Dr. John Soden? And can you just give us a little bit of background of yourself?
Doing great. Yep, sure. I did my education, Biola University undergrad, seminary was at Dallas Seminary, PhD was at Dallas Seminary in Semitic and Old Testament studies. I was a pastor then for a little over 9 years in Southwest Colorado. And then I have been at Lancaster Bible College and Capital Seminary in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. for the last 25 years.
Awesome. And you also wrote a very interesting book, which is a big reason why we're here. Can you tell the audience a little bit about the book and maybe just any other work you've done since then?
Sure. So I wrote In the Beginning We Misunderstood, put out by Kriegel, 2012. And it is looking at, my co-author is Johnny Miller. He was the pastor of the church that I attended at the time. And we wanted to enter the discussion of how the people in the church typically talk about Genesis 1 with regard to the relationship between science and faith. And what we wanted to do was show that Genesis 1 is not really a text dealing with science, and that the issue of old earth, young earth, for example, needs to be taken out of the context of how do we connect the events of Genesis 1 with the events of science, because it wasn't written in a scientific time. So we both described a little bit of our background and experiences, and then I did quite a lot of research on the backgrounds so that we could place Genesis 1 in particular, the creation of the initial creation account, Genesis 1, 1 to 2, 3, place that into its context and show how an ancient audience, particularly Israel coming out of Egypt, would have heard those words, what they would have understood in Genesis 1, long before Copernicus and the way we understand our universe, and what it would have meant to them, because that dramatically changes how we read the text and how we understand some of the things that are going on there. I think it helps us to recognize that our assumptions about the background, about the text, and about the meaning of certain things makes a huge difference on what we understand. And what we understand, or what we want to understand, is what God intended it to mean to the original audience, not what we assume it means because of our 21st century perceptions. So in entering the conversation, we wanted to help people to recognize that the issue shouldn't be, are you Orthodox because you believe in a young earth or an old earth? The issue should be, what did God intend for this to mean, and what was he trying to communicate to his people? And then later we can apply that to our understanding of science or anything else, but we need to understand the text on its own terms, in its own context first. So that's really my burden. That's what I was trying to accomplish, and what we were trying to do as we were talking about this, to maybe lower the temperature a little bit of the conversation and make it more exegetical and dealing with the text rather than trying to bring science into it too soon.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now? Right, and it's fairly interesting. You know, your book isn't like, it's not a science book. I mean, you barely even mention the word science. It's mainly focused on just, how do you interpret the Bible like the way it should be, which I really
Right.
appreciate that. Um, so, and I mean, you talked about a pretty good intro there. Can you give us just? I mean, you do believe that Moses wrote Genesis. So, considering you believe that, like, what reason would we think um, what reason would we have to think that the Israelites that Moses was writing for had any idea about anything Egyptian as far as like what they believed
Sure.
or writing techniques or anything like that?
Because I do accept the basic narrative of Scripture as true, and by the way, caveat, that doesn't mean that I believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch exactly as we have it. I have no problem with some later editing of the text. Some of that is really easy to show. God can use an inspired editor later as well. I do believe, however, that Moses wrote the basic contours of the Pentateuch. And so saying that Moses wrote Genesis 1 is not a problem to me. I do believe in a historical exodus, that Israel was actually in Egypt and that they did come out. There are some really helpful works that deal with that from an evangelical perspective. I'd recommend Jim Hoffmeyer, Israel in Egypt and Israel in Sinai. But beyond that, just free plug for Jim, but beyond that, the reason I say that is because a lot of people don't believe there was ever an exodus, that there was ever Israel in Egypt. Um, and so that becomes problematic. But the fact that I do recognize that, I do believe that to be true historically, means that if the biblical narrative is accurate, Israel was in Egypt for a very long time. We're talking 400 years. To be in a country 400 years means you're going to absorb their culture, you're going to absorb their way of thinking, their cognitive environment, so to speak, which means if your family came over to the United States sometime in the last 200 years or 300 years or 400 years, you probably think of yourself more as an American than you do as a European or African or Asian or wherever your family came from. That being said, Israel was still dramatically confined to their own uh, subgroup, which meant they couldn't really mix well. So they stayed Israelite, but that doesn't mean that their thinking stayed monotheistic or Yahvistic. And we know that because we know that when they came out of Egypt, they were still carrying around their Egyptian gods with them. We know that from Joshua. Joshua 24 tells us that. We know that from Ezekiel. He talks very strongly about Israel's failure to worship Yahweh alone and bringing their Egyptian gods along. And that's Joshua 24, for example, is a long time after. That's after 40 years of exile or 40 years of desert plus maybe 25 to 35 years in the land. So it was a long time that they hung on to their Egyptian identity in those sorts of ways. We also know that many Egyptians came with them. So there's just a lot going on. To be thinking then and talking in Egyptian ways means that they are sharing those same world pictures, images, and even worldview. So their perspective on God or the gods is going to be very warped, and their perspective on who they are as human beings, as a nation, is going to be very warped. And I'm suggesting that what God is actually doing with Genesis 1 and Genesis as a book as a whole is he's addressing many of those concerns to show the nation and really the world as well who he is, who they are, what their responsibilities are before him, how they need to understand how his world works and how they are within his world, what that's going to require. All that sort of stuff is going to be very much important to Israel coming out of Egypt. So yeah, they are steeped in Egyptian everything. To find Egyptian background ideas and motifs and so on in the book of Genesis, and Genesis 1 in particular, is not a huge surprise.
Yeah, totally. So you talked about, just, the background, but, a lot of people are going to be asking, like, why is that even important to begin with? I mean, especially, if the Bible's supposed to be clear and all that, why does it matter if the people that were writing it were in a specific context?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a question that is asked a lot. I could probably a little bit facetiously hand you my Hebrew Bible and say, please read this to me and tell me how clear it is. and you may or may not be able to read it. Depends on if you know Hebrew, correct? So, so we recognize that there's a context that we have to get past because it wasn't written to us. It wasn't written immediately in our context, language, history, background, anything. It was written thousands of years ago, and it was written with a very different context in mind. And it was written to those people so they would have understood it. So it's written in their cognitive environment, in their thinking, and with their words and their meanings. And if I were to say to you, the Buccaneers slaughtered the Colts last night, the context matters very much. If you know that I'm talking about 21st century American football, that is one thing. If you think I'm talking about 17th century privateering, that's going to be something very different. And if I'm talking about how they showed up at Assateague and slaughtered the Colts, that's going to be a very different conversation than Tom Brady winning a football game or whatever. So context does matter because the meaning of the terms matters, the implications of the terms, not just the denotations, but the connotations of the terms matter dramatically as well. So when we talk about some of these things and we hear them and see them in our context, that doesn't guarantee that I am hearing and seeing what the original audience would have heard and seen, what they would have thought of, because their world picture. When I think of that, when I'm talking world picture, I'm not talking about a snapshot I take outside. But what I am talking about is how the world actually works and functions. And we see our world picture is the Earth is a globe spinning in empty space with a moon going around it, and the sun or the Earth and moon are going around the sun, and all that's going through this universe. In the ancient world, they didn't perceive of it like that at all. You have basically a flat Earth, which you don't get changed until much later. You have wherever they are is pretty much the center of that. You have water everywhere. So up there is water, down there is water, and we're this little snow globe is the way I like to think about it, sort of floating in dark, watery, chaotic mass. And the sun traverses the top of that snow globe, and the moon and the stars as well. And they go down in Egypt, it's the duat at night, and then they come out the next day and do it again. And so you've got this very different picture of what's going on in terms of the structure of our universe. Our world picture is very different than theirs. And that's going to come out as in the ways things are described. So in the Psalms, you talk about the roots of the mountains, and we've got these other things like, what does it mean to separate the waters from the waters? And we'll get with that later. But all of that fits very differently and very well within their world picture, not so well within our world picture.
Very fascinating and well said. Okay, so many people are very familiar with Genesis 1 and 2, but many are not familiar with what happens in the Egyptian creation text. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, let me also give another caveat to that one as well. And the reason is that with Mesopotamia, we have several pretty complete creation accounts. In Egypt, we don't. We have one fairly complete creation account. And from that, we also have thousands of texts that have pieces of the creation account. And as we look around all the Egyptian literature and put those pieces together, those pieces of creation, of the creation narrative that was in Egypt, are in a number of different genres or places. So you've got the Book of the Dead, you've got the pyramid texts, you've got the coffin texts, you've got the Memphite theology, which is the one main text. So there's just a lot of different places where you see these pieces. They're very consistent. They did change the names of the main gods depending on which city they were and which gods they thought were most important. But basically the events and all that remain consistent over actually thousands of years. So Egyptologists tell us, and everything I've read corroborates, that the basic narrative of creation did not change all that much for these thousands of years, even though we don't have a bunch of clear, full texts of the whole creation account. So when I talk about the Egyptian creation account, what we're talking about is piecing together all of these pieces of creation that we see in all the various texts, which are myriad, lots of them, but recognizing that as we piece them all together, it's like they're all pieces for the same puzzle. They're all showing the same picture. They're all giving us the same basic information, different parts of it in different ways, but still basically the same information. So when I say that, then we look at those creation accounts and we realize that those events are pretty much standard in Egyptian fare as we go through the centuries. And what we see with it, I actually, in my book, I gave a nice little chart. I thought it was nice, at least, that develops the sort of the main contours of the creation of the Egyptian creation that follows. And ironically, and I think it's significant as well, it follows the basic events of Genesis 1 to the T. Starts with this. Everything is dark, watery, chaotic mass. This is just, there's four terms they use, and that watery, unlimited, darkness, imperceptibility, those are kind of the main four terms. And that's just everywhere. And then this God sort of appears. He creates himself, actually, in their theology. He appears in that water. He begins to speak creation into existence, and the first event is light. And then from the light, you've got separating the waters so that you have so it's all water. This atmosphere separates out. Then you have this land that coalesces in the middle and in the bottom, and so you have this thing going around. Then you have the sun rising in this in its orbit, and then you have the creation of the plants and the fish and the birds and the animals and man, and at the end of this, the God rests. Basically, you have all the same events all the way through, and they're all in the same order, but the picturing of it is very different from what we assume when we read Genesis 1 from our context.
That is very fascinating. Okay, I cannot wait to get into that. Okay, so do we know what creation texts would have been in circulation during the time of the Exodus?
So because of what I just said, that's a difficult question because we don't know what creation texts there may have been in terms of full pieces other than the Memphite theology. Now, the Memphite theology is an interesting one because it's the only full text we have. It's actually, it was carved into a stone, and that stone was repurposed. And when it was carved into a stone, it said it was repurposed as a grindstone. So we don't have everything on there, but when it was carved, it was actually carved as the scribes were preserving much more ancient texts by carving it onto the stone. And so the stone itself is later than the Exodus, but it tells us that it was a text that was much earlier, which would have been then in circulation at the same time. Plus, we have all these other pieces which go from long before, in fact, over 1,000 years of history. The basic contours of it don't change for the pieces that we have in the various places. So we don't have a single text from that time period, but we have a lot of evidence that the contours that we have, the basic narrative that we have of creation from an Egyptian perspective didn't change during that entire period, and actually was in existence long before, no matter which date of the Exodus we choose, long before the Exodus.
Very fascinating. Okay, so do you think that Egyptian count started with unordered, watery, darkness, parallel, that depending on your view of Genesis 1, a lot of people would say that Genesis 1 starts with that darkness. So
Right.
Can you talk about that
Yeah.
and the similarities, if you think so?
Yeah, I do think so. There's been a couple different scholars that have written on that, comparing those and saying, these are just too close to be coincidental. But in Genesis 1, my understanding of Genesis 1, the way I take it, and I argue for this in the book, but others argue for this as well, that Genesis 1:1 is the summary title of the section. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In other words, God created everything. Now, let me tell you how he did it. Genesis 1:2 is the real starting point of how he's going to describe creation. So I'm not arguing God didn't create everything out of nothing. I fully agree with that. Scripture later tells us completely that's true, but I'm saying Genesis 1 isn't describing that. He's saying, okay, let me tell you about creation, and let me start with this dark, watery, chaotic mass. The formless, void, darkness, and deep are the four terms that are used in Genesis 1:2. And from that, God is going to bring life and good, thriving and good life in the midst of all this. So he's going to reorder all of his creation, beginning with those qualities in Genesis 1:2, which is actually the way the creation accounts are described in Egypt. It begins with this, it doesn't begin with nothing, it begins with this pervasive dark water. And in that, the God creates himself. He didn't exist before. That's a very significant difference from Genesis 1, of course. And then within that, he creates what we would call creation. He makes it the way we now know it, including making all the gods. But the reason I say that is that Genesis 1:1 or Genesis 1:2 through the rest of the chapter is very much describing the same ideas in the same order, in the same sorts of ways as the Egyptians would talk about their creation. And yet there's some radical discontinuity that we need to notice as well, which we can get to.
Awesome. Okay. So in your book, you also talked about that it's like a wind in Egyptian text. Could you talk about that? And I mean, I know that in 1:3, Genesis 1:3, that there might be a similarity there.
So, right. So in the Egyptian text, the initial creator God is the God of wind, and we see him sort of in the waters. And then we have the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters in Genesis. The word ruach for spirit is also the word for wind. So scholars have debated this for a long time as to whether this is intended to be a great wind, or whether this is supposed to be the wind of God, or whether this is the Spirit of God. And my suggestion is that the original audience would have probably recognized a double entendre here. They initially would have thought of wind because that's what they're thinking of with the Egyptian creation account. But on the other hand, as we're reading through the text, this is God at work. And so this wind of God, or this Spirit of God, becomes much more the personal working of God within the context of creation, as opposed to wind itself. And that's really not that far from the Egyptian perspective either, because we're talking about the God of wind. So we're not talking about just wind as a natural phenomenon divorced from anything spiritual. In Egypt, it would have been thought in very much spiritual terms. And so to think of that in terms of God at work is not very much of a difference.
Yeah, so it really, even if you don't translate it wind in Genesis 1:3, you can still have that similarity. So you talked about, the spoken word, and my understanding is that we don't have that in all Egyptian text.
Correct.
Is that right? Or can you talk about that similarity, and as well as like if it being in certain texts matters at all?
Yeah. No, actually, I think so. Creation happens in several ways in Egypt. So it happens by spitting, it happens by masturbation, it happens by speaking. And Moses chose that metaphor of speaking as the means by which God creates. And the reason I say metaphor is, if we believe Jesus, that God is spirit and is not corporal. And of course, that's consistent throughout Scripture. God doesn't have a body, he's spirit. He doesn't have lips, mouth, teeth, gums. So speaking is not the same thing for God as it is for us. It's very much an anthropomorphism. But that's a very important one in Genesis 1, because in each case, God is speaking things into existence. And the implication, I think, is really clear that God is willing it to happen, willing it to become. But the anthropomorphism is really helpful because one of the implications of God as creator is that God is sovereign over all. God is king. And who is it that speaks and it happens no matter what he says? Well, the closest we come to it, humanly speaking, is the king. When the king speaks, it happens because somebody carries out his word. In creation, God speaks and it happens. It just effortlessly does. There's no battle, there's no struggle, it happens. But it shows his sovereignty, it shows his control over all. And this is, again, very significant within the context because Genesis 1 presents God as outside of all of creation and creating, as opposed to the Egyptian God who's within creation, part of creation, and actually is one of the pieces of creation, even though he's creating other gods and creating other things. So, a very different perception of God, but a very similar way of seeing his activity that helps us as human beings to get a better handle on his sovereign authority over all things, over all creative things, all creation.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we have the light before the sun, and a lot of people have said that means that Genesis 1 must be figurative, but we also have that in a lot of other texts, including Egyptian creation texts. Could you talk about those?
Sure. So the concept across the ancient world, not just Egypt, but Mesopotamia, probably Canaan, although there's very little evidence to know for sure how Canaan thought. We don't have nearly as many texts. But clearly in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the perception was that light was a thing all by itself. It didn't have to have a light giver, didn't need a sun or a moon or stars or whatever to give light, didn't need a flashlight. Light was just something that occurred by itself. It was an independent object, so to speak. So to have light before the sun is not an unusual thing. And probably again, as I think you suggested, it is an observational thing because you see light apart from a light giver. You see light before the sun rises, and after the sun goes down, it's still lingering. So how can that be if it has to have the sun? Obviously, we would describe that in one way, but observationally, without knowing the physics of it, it makes it a very different thing. So in the ancient world, it wasn't a surprise to have light first. Now, the question that we wrestle with as 21st century believers, looking at Genesis 1 is, but isn't he telling us the truth? So therefore, you had to have light before you had the sun. And what I'm suggesting is that's not the issue here at all. He is telling us the truth, but he's using their language. He's not endorsing their view of science, so to speak, but he's using their language, which, as I think I've said, they themselves would have understood much of it to be figurative anyway. So an illustration would be that I might say to you, hey, did you see the beautiful sunrise this morning? Now, you wouldn't stop and correct me and say, wait a minute, the sun didn't rise. You know that the earth is spinning on its axis and the sun was below the horizon. As the earth spun, the sun became visible. You wouldn't say that because we all know that. You would simply say, yeah, that was really gorgeous, wasn't it? Or no, I didn't get to see it. Tell me about it. We talk about the sunrise. Jesus talked about the sunrise. Surely Jesus knew better, but that's just the language of observation. That's the way it looks. You see sun coming up and you're thinking, oh, the sun's coming up. The sun is rising. It's not really, but we don't stop to correct it. We just use that language. And that's what I'm suggesting Moses is doing. He's just using their language. And by using their language, he's saying all these things that we talk about that had to happen in creation, God did them. And God really did them. It's not that it's not historical. It is, but it's not scientifically precise.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, if we're going to take that to its logical conclusion, we also read Revelation. We have, it seems to say that Jesus was the light before on day one. The verse will actually be down there. I can't remember what it was right now. And we also have other texts in the Psalms, I believe, where we have God is kind of described in the same terms as like a sun or brightness and light and all that. So, I mean, do you think it's
God is
possible?
light, and in Him is no darkness at all. We can talk about
Right.
any of those sorts of things. Certainly, I mean that's absolutely true. I don't have
Hmm.
any question about that. But I don't think that is trying. Those statements, I would say, are not trying to speak ontologically either. So they're not trying to say the essence of God is lightness, but it's trying to say something figurative about God, that He is absolutely holy and that there's no sin and there's no darkness. Um, those figurative expressions don't require then that the light at the beginning had to be God Himself or Jesus pre-incarnate or those sorts of things. In my view, I don't see that requires that necessarily at all. Could it have been? I suppose it could have been. I'm not saying it wasn't, only because um, I'm suggesting it's not giving us enough information to be able to say this is trying to make an ontological statement about what physical entities were existing at that point. Rather, I'm suggesting that they're just using um, the naturally observant figurative language that everybody talks about in order to communicate something that they didn't understand, and that is who God is as creator and that He's transcendent.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so can you talk about the similarities in the Egyptian gods separating the waters to create an atmosphere?
Well, the similarity is really language. So in Genesis, we see that God separated the waters from the waters. And let's see, he said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And the challenge that we have faced forever is, what on earth does that mean? Where are the waters up there? And some people would say, well, that's just the clouds in the sky. Maybe, but that's certainly not the way an Egyptian would have thought of it. So Whitcomb and Morris for a while were saying, well, there must have been a vapor canopy up there, and they put all this water up there, and then it came down in the flood. Well, uh, many young Earth creationists today have abandoned that because the laws of physics don't work so well. But I don't think that's the issue here. The terminology is very similar to what we're doing. As I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that God did was, so you've got this, it's all water, and you have this waters being separated so that you have atmosphere, and now all of a sudden you have this bubble of light and order. Well, order first, and order becoming atmosphere, at least, with then the light is added and the order is added, and it's floating around in the midst of the darkness. That snow globe effect, that bubble, is what is being described by the Egyptian accounts, and there's nothing to suggest it's different in Genesis 1. The rakia, the dome, is perceived as holding back the waters. That's a very consistent ancient Near Eastern way of perceiving it, of describing the physical universe. That doesn't mean that they didn't recognize that wasn't exactly right, but it means that's the way it looked. That's the way it assumed, that they assumed it must have been something similar to that, or they're not sure. Oftentimes we see that dome resting on the mountains, but they knew that wasn't the case either. They went up to some of those mountains. They knew that there was no dome on it if you got there, but there's still this perception because that's the way it looks, and so that's the way it's being described. So my suggestion, as I'm reading all this and as I'm looking at it, and I'm simply saying, Moses is taking their language and he's using it to describe what God did without endorsing a particular functional view of the universe. He's simply using figurative language that they would all say, yeah, that makes sense. The sun rises. And then he is saying, so let me tell you who made that sunrise.
Yeah, I like that. So on day 3, you also have some type of separating, which is the waters, the waters below, and then land appears. Can you talk about that
Right.
and how that relates to the Egyptian accounts?
Well, the next event in the Egyptian count is this primordial mound rises out of the waters, And so you have land appearing, if you will, and that's really what's happening here. And interestingly, again, as we read the account in English and as we think about the account from our perspective, we have to make some significant adjustments to try to figure it all out because, he says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered into one place and let the dry land appear. And it was so. Wait a minute. If you look at our globe, are the waters all in one place? Well, not exactly, and you don't have just one set of dry land. You've got all these continents. And, well, we're translating that into our perspective, but from their viewpoint, that's exactly the way they would have thought of it. Okay, so land is right there in it, and water's all around it, but the land is all sort of coalescing in the middle. So it's just very consistent with their terminology.
Could you mentioned it a few times, but could you just briefly sum up the order of creation where you have the Genesis account and the Egyptian account and how they're similar?
Okay. So both of them have this beginning with the watery, unlimited darkness. In verse 2 of Genesis, it is formless, void, darkness, and deep. Both of them have the Spirit of God, or the wind, the God of wind, hovering on the waters. Both of them you have the God speaking and it happens. Both of them you have light being created next. Then you have the waters being created to separate atmosphere out. You have the land being separated out. You have the sun rising, and then, of course, that's day 4. You've got the gods creating the fish, birds, animal life. The only difference that I was able to discover here is that plants are in Egyptian creation account. Plants are included there, and of course, plants are in day 3 in the biblical account. And I'm not sure that that's always the case in the Egyptian account. It's just that those were the only places I could find it. In both cases, you have next mankind is being created, and in both cases, at least in many of the Egyptian accounts, you've got mankind being created in the image of gods, or you have at least the Pharaoh being created in the image of God. Egypt is the only place where there is at least a mention of humanity in general being in the image of God. Otherwise, it's just the Pharaoh or the king. In both cases, after the creation account, the God rests. And so there's just a consistent order all the way through. It's exactly the same order. It is, it's amazing when you compare them. Now, that doesn't mean everything's the same. If you're reading an Egyptian account, if you read through the Memphite theology, you're going to say, wait a minute, that is very different from Genesis 1. It's absolutely amen and praise the Lord.
That's awesome. Okay, so I mean, you're making these similarities, and you say it's figurative language and all that, but I mean, do you also think that the Egyptians are also using figurative language when they think this?
I do. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm assuming, and I think Dick Averbeck's one who has shown more with Mesopotamian material, but has shown that these sorts of images for the average person were understood to be figurative largely. Now, did everybody understand it to be figurative? I don't know. If you go over to Papua New Guinea and you go to some of those tribesmen that don't have any idea of Copernicus, would they understand the sun isn't really rising? I'm not sure. Would they see that as figurative? I don't know. Does your 4-year-old know that the earth is a ball spinning and the sun is just being revealed over the horizon? I don't know. So could some people be taking it much more woodenly, much more literally? Sure. But we do know that many of them understood that this was clearly just observational speech rather than clear, intentional literalism. So I'm just assuming then, I'm suggesting that while on the one hand we know many of them are taking it figuratively, Moses is just using that language not to say this is a scientific reality, but to say, okay, the way you're talking about it, that works. Let me tell you who did that. Let me tell you, because really the burden of Genesis is to teach Israel about God, not to teach Israel physics or astrophysics or how the earth works. It's just, he's not teaching them science.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so on day 5, you have these great sea creatures being mentioned that God
Right.
creates, and a lot of scholars have mentioned that it's not the same word used as Leviathan, but it's the word Tanim, which is most whenever it's mentioned, it's often mentioned in the context of some type of like chaos monster or something like that. Do you think there's anything in Egypt that parallels that concept, or like
Mhm.
otherwise, like why do you think it's in there?
Yeah, no, I do. One of the things that we don't often recognize probably is how well or how much um, ideas, particularly theological ideas, transcended cultures across the ancient world. So from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Canaan, at the time of Israel coming out of Egypt, we know, and we can, there's inscriptional evidence to show that many of the deities and many of the stories and many of the ideas are across all of those cultures. So they're very similar. Canaanite gods are very much worshipped in Egypt as well. And some of those show up in scripture. You see things like, we probably wouldn't notice it, but in the book of Judges, there's one of the minor judges is Shamgar, and it says he's Ben Anat, or son of Anat. Probably, I think the best understanding of that is not that his mama's name was Anat. Anat is the goddess of war and love, but rather there was one scholar has shown an inscription where there was a regiment of Egyptian mercenaries, Hurrian mercenaries, and the name of their regiment was Ben Anat. They were the sons of Anat. And so I think a very plausible understanding of Shamgar is that Shamgar's not a Hebrew name, and that he is a foreign mercenary who God uses to deliver his people. We don't know much about him. It's only one verse, so there's not a whole lot in Judges about him. But the point I'm making is that Anat is a Canaanite god found in an Egyptian context. And this is not very long after the Exodus. We're talking about the period of the Judges. And that's consistent. So we have a lot of those sorts of things. So when we're talking about things like light before the sun, or we're talking about the names of the gods or the ideas, some of the ideas of creation and so on, there's no surprise to see that a lot of these things are very consistent all the way across from Mesopotamia to Egypt and in between, which is Canaan. So those ideas transcend those cultures quite readily. There's just a lot of commerce going, a lot of trade and warfare and migrations, and so ideas go with people.
Yeah, we also have the Baal temple sometime around the Exodus, and we also have. Okay, so in your book, you talked about how God rested. Is there anything in Egypt that kind of parallels that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Ta rests. Ta was the god that created in the Memphite theology. So he was the main god at Memphis. In his creation account, at the end of his creation account, he rested. We see this in the Mesopotamian accounts as well. John Walton makes a big deal of it because he's comparing it to the um, temple building. And I think there's really a lot to say there. I appreciate a lot of what John does. I don't agree with him on the fact that it's merely function, but a lot of people don't. That's not a surprise. He's a great guy, and I think he has a lot of really helpful insights there. But the resting of the God at the end is not going in and taking a nap. The resting of the God at the end is entering into his temple sanctuary and taking up his authority and ruling his kingdom. So it's not doing anything. It's just that the creative work has stopped. And I think that's significant for Yahweh as well. And I agree with John and with many others who have pointed out that Genesis 1 is very much temple imagery. We see it even more in Genesis 2 and the garden. I think that's very much temple imagery, temple precinct imagery, the pleasure garden, or the uh, the orchard that went with a temple or went with a palace. And Adam and Eve are very much presented not only as his ruling images in Genesis 1, but I think Genesis 1 includes this less clearly, but Genesis 2 much more clearly, that Adam and Eve are very much the priest and priestess in God's kingdom as well. So I say that because the rest of God then is, on the one hand, there is a important corollary with humanity and how Israel is supposed to imitate their God by resting on the seventh day. But more importantly, for Genesis 1, God is the sovereign and control of all of creation. And so his rest and his entering into his rest has to do with the fact that he is taking control, he is exercising control over all things created, not just in Egypt, it would be over a piece of it. So you have the God of the Nile, or you have the God of the atmosphere, you have the God of the heavens, or you have the God of the land, or you have the God of this, that, and the other thing. And they had literally 1,500 or more gods or semi-gods. In Mesopotamia, you have the same sort of thing. You have gods of this, that, and the other thing. In Canaan, we are probably more familiar with it because Baal is the god of the storm, and you have Mot, the god of death, and Yam, the god of the sea. And so all of that is to recognize that Yahweh is presenting himself quite differently than the gods of the ancient world. He is not connected to any material aspect. And as you alluded, or you began to say at least, when he put the sun, moon, and stars in place, he's putting them in place in terms of ruling over the day and the night. But those are not divine functions. They are not given divine spheres and ruling as gods. In fact, the difference is dramatic there. And a number of scholars have mentioned it, but they're not named, because if you name them, you are naming gods. But at the same time, their subservience to him is obvious, that he is in control of all of these things. He puts them in place. He controls them. He's the one who is actually sovereign over everything. So that realm and that rest are critical to understanding the role of God and the place of God, as opposed to the gods of the ancient world, who had their own little spheres but had no real control outside of that.
That is very, very fascinating. Wow. Okay. Uh, this is a bit off the cuff. There's a few similarities in Egypt compared to the rest of Genesis 1 to 11, right? I mean, there's some type of tree and serpent. Do you know of any others in the Egyptian world?
Yeah, so the creation account has the creation of man in chapter 2 has some strong similarities, because um, in Genesis 2, you've got humanity, God creates him from the dust, and the terms are the terms of forming, as if you would be forming them on a wheel, like a potter's wheel. And that's exactly what we have in Egypt as well. So you have the same idea, only it is not all of humanity being formed on a potter's wheel. It's just the Pharaoh who's being formed on a potter's wheel. Um, Ironically, and I think maybe significantly, all of humanity is understood to be God's son, God's images, God's representative rulers, as opposed to just the king. So it's not just Pharaoh or the king of Mesopotamia, but it's all of humanity, which gives all of humanity a very different value and function before God than we see in the ancient world. In the ancient world, all the rest of humanity are just the God's cattle. They're the ones who take care of God, and God can use them and abuse them. And that's true in Egypt. That's true in Mesopotamia. But you get to the Bible, and all of humanity are his images, his image bearers, and have great value, and are significant as his servants. And he cares for mankind, not the other way around. Mesopotamia is even more stark, I suppose you could say, in the fact that humanity was created to care for the gods. The humans were created to do all the chores that the gods were tired of doing, and yet you go to Genesis 1 and 2, and it is God who is, particularly chapter 2, God is not only caring for man, but providing his every need, and caring very closely for humanity. So very different theology. even though the world picture is very similar because he's using language that just speaks to them and doesn't necessarily speak to us.
Yeah, totally. So any other thoughts on similarities in Genesis 2:11?
Yes, for the most part, I would say 2 to 11 probably follows the Mesopotamian literature more closely than it does the Egyptian, which is interesting. But I think it's also important to recognize. But probably the other thing that I think is significant here is the snake account in chapter 3. We do see some talking snakes in Egypt. They happen to be gods, which is, I think, significant because it shows up something of the uh, spiritual aspect. The second thing that I think is helpful here is to recognize the warfare imagery that's going on in chapter 3. Dick Averbeck has written a really helpful article on that. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but I can find it if you're interested later.
Totally.
But he is showing how what many people have called chaos kampf, which is the battle with chaos in creation that the gods doing battle. And you mentioned Tanin or Leviathan, and that's usually very much part of that chaos kampf motif. That shows up very strongly in many of the creation accounts, particularly in Mesopotamia. But what we see in the creation account in Genesis 1 is no battle at all. There is no struggle. It is purely God sovereignly, effortlessly creating everything, and they're under his control. The battle shows up in chapter 3. The battle shows up with the challenge of the snake to God's authority through Adam and Eve. And so Dick has helpfully drawn out a lot of that and shown that they would have probably would easily have recognized that as that chaos conf motif, not directly with creation, but with the God of creation and with the representative that he has on earth. So those are some of the things. It is probably more the order and the events are stronger with Mesopotamia from chapters 2 through 11 than chapter 1.
Yeah, that makes sense. With the flood and
Right.
all the different other stuff there. So, this really begs a question regards to like why this text was written. I mean, the people are coming out of Egypt. It seems almost a little odd to at least me or 21st century readers in general. It's like, why in the world do these people care like who created the world? Do you have any idea, what you think is the purpose? I mean, I've heard some people say that, it's kind of like a polemic, like, Yahweh is the real one who created everything, not these other gods that you were worshiping in Egypt. I mean, is that what you think, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I think it's a combination. Polemic is really important because they were believing a totally unbiblical, and I think that's an appropriate word here, worldview, because what they understood from their Egyptian background is all these gods that are involved in all these various places, and you have to appease all the gods, and you have to do all these things, and God who is calling them to be His people and to represent Him to the world, to show the world who He is, so that the world can find blessing. It's the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This God is calling them to show the world who He is by living it out as His servants. And so the Mosaic covenant, when He brings them out of Egypt, is saying, you're my people. You represent me to the world. And God, Yahweh, is the means by which the world will find blessing. It's in knowing and walking with God. So they've got to know who He is. So Israel certainly on the one hand needs to recognize the differences, and there's polemic there in saying those gods know me, yes. But it's more than that. They have to really actually know who God is in a positive sense. They have to be willing and able to represent that to the world so the world understands who He is. And they have to recognize their role before Him, their place before Him, who they are, and what that means in terms of their value, what that means in terms of their service, what that means in terms of of how they respond to him. And all of that is part of experiencing God's blessing, but it's also part of sharing God's blessing and showing the world um, God's goodness and God's greatness. So it's not merely polemic in the sense of, um, let me show you who is bad and who is not God and what that means, but let me show you who God is, what his characteristics are. The fact that 7 times God saw that it was good, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good, tells us something not just about what God makes, but who God is. And the fact that God is the one who brings good out of darkness and chaos, disorder, that sort of thing. And we see that it starts with God taking darkness and moving it to good and order and life and bringing the atmosphere and the world in which he can thrive. You get to the end of the book of Genesis, and in chapter 50, you have Joseph being confronted by his brothers who say, hey, don't kill us. Dad's dead now, but please don't kill us. We didn't really mean it. And Joseph says, who am I, God? You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. What did God do? He took darkness and chaos and struggle, which Israel is very much going to identify with as they come out of Egypt. They've been in darkness, and that was the image of Egypt to Moses or to Abraham in Genesis 15. And they've been in oppression, and yet God is saying, but I'm going to make good out of this. And he still does.
Yeah, that's really great. So you briefly mentioned it, but in your book you made a really, really interesting point in regards to what it says in it's Exodus, I believe, where it says God made the heavens and earth in 6 days, but then it says something about resting, and you mentioned that he was refreshed.
Yeah. 31:17 is helpful. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. The point I made in the book, and the point that I think is interesting here, is that the word for refreshed is usually, it's not used a whole lot, and it's used of David after battle, and we're thinking he was just totally exhausted and he needed to be refreshed. And you're thinking, wait. This is God? God needed to be refreshed after resting? No. But what it is doing, it's another anthropomorphism that's saying, so God is resting, and God is serving in his kingdom. But you as human beings, well, just like God, you do need to be refreshed, and you need to rest in a little different way. So I think there's an interesting application for us there. Anyway, that's thank you for redirecting my thoughts.
Yeah, totally. All right. This has been so great. I really appreciate you talking to me. Is there any resources where more people can look at your stuff, or books that they can check out or anything like that?
Yeah, so I don't have any other books yet. Lord willing, there will be a commentary coming out eventually from Kriegel with their K-Brooks series on Genesis. That's just about drafted, but I'm not sure when it'll come out. So the In the Beginning We Misunderstood is the only full-length book. I do have a few articles out there. There's if you're interested on the creation of man in Genesis 2, I did a BibSac article in 2016 from the dust. But yeah, I'm on Amazon, so you can look it up there and get the book there if you wish.
Awesome. That's so exciting. All right. I really hope you have a great rest of your day, Dr. Soden.